On today's episode of Today in World War II, the very first British soldier in World War II dies. The Japanese tighten the vice on Britain's colony of Hong Kong. The American 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal bids farewell to that infested, horrible island. And finally, Soviet troops and their offensive in 44 reached the Danube River north of Budapest. Let's get started. Okay. So on December 9th, 1939, the very first British soldier of World War II was killed. 27-year-old Corporal Thomas Pridet was leading a patrol near Metz, France. This was during the Phoney War, so there was no actual shooting going on, but unfortunately, he was killed by friendly artillery fire and he perished. Uh, by the end of the war, 384,000 British soldiers would die in the war. Understand that, it was a whole different scale than what the Soviet Union and China suffered in World War II. I mean, they were different estimates, but the 20 million in the Soviet Union, around 20 million. That's what the People's Republic of China says died, civilians and soldiers. So the losses, obviously, in those two theaters of the war are massive. And if you compare, 384,000 British soldiers who died in the war, you think, well, that's hardly anything. Well, look at the population as well, right? I mean, the British population was a whole lot different. So that was still, a huge sacrifice on the side of Great Britain and the Commonwealth to, that they gave for freedom to stop the Nazis and stop fascism in their tracks, at least temporarily. Fast forward 70 years later, but well, that's a discussion for a different time. But it was interesting that kind of ironic because this first casualty happens during the Phoney War where nobody's fighting on the Western Front. The Germans kept postponing their invasion dates. Probably 6 or 7 times they postponed their offensive against France and in the Low Countries. They don't invade until later in the spring of 1940. In the meantime, they bombing raids would happen. The naval warfare was hot, but for the most part, on the front, the soldiers sat around twiddling their thumbs until this time when, unfortunately, Corporal Pridet was the first victim of, well, in this case, ironically, friendly fire because the Germans weren't shooting. Okay. So what I would love for you to do would be to go ahead and click on the subscribe button and click on the bell that notifies you whenever I drop a new video. Has it really hit you yet that I'm going to be asking you to do this every single time? So you might as well just go ahead and get over with and do it, okay? I appreciate it. So on December 9th, 1941, the Japanese troops breached a part of the defense line on the western segment of the British gin drinkers line outside of Hong Kong. This was part of the Japanese offensive that occurred, after Pearl Harbor. This was a coordinated strategy. The Japanese were they attempted to decapitate the American naval power at Pearl Harbor, did not succeed, but they did succeed in their other objectives, which was to sweep down from Japan and from Taiwan, where they had bases. And they want to take the Philippines, they want to take the British colony, different colonies like Hong Kong and Singapore, and they wanted to take the Dutch East Indies, which was, Malaysia, and well, Malaysia was a British colony, but Indonesia, Bali, Borneo, those places. And the reason why was because that's where all the natural resources were. Remember, Japan had to import almost everything. It was like Great Britain in that sense, no natural resources. Everything had to be imported. And one of the reasons why the war started was because of their aggressive and their war, the Japanese war in China. President Roosevelt had initiated stricter and stricter embargoes against them for scrap metal and oil. Because remember, the United States was like Saudi Arabia is now, uh, as far as they were a major oil exporter, and Japan got most of its oil from the United States. And of course, when we turned the spigot off, that the Japanese had about 6 months of oil and petroleum that they could use, and they decided to, rather than admit that they had a disastrous policy in China anyway, rather than pulling back, they couldn't do that because of their pride. They decided, well, you push us in a corner, we're going to attack. And that's what they did. So in this case, they went after Hong Kong. And remember, Hong Kong is basically an island in southern China. And you had British and Canadian troops here, but they had no chance of fighting off the Japanese with no support, no naval support, no reinforcements, and so on and so forth. And they fought courageously. And this we're going to chronicle this as the next days go by. But this was the time when this first time when the Japanese broke through one of the major defense lines that the British had set up. And 200, or excuse me, 27 prisoners were taken. I'm not going to talk yet about what the Japanese did to their prisoners in Hong Kong, but it was bad. Okay, let's put it that way. So, what I would like for you to do right now is to like the video and leave a comment. Uh, Algorithm, that's all I'm going to say. Algorithm, help me with algorithm. Okay, if you do those two things, you help me, and I appreciate it. Okay, on December 9th, 1942, the 1st Marine Division under General Alexander Vandegrift, which had been fighting nonstop since the invasion in October. This was, uh, one of the. I mean, this whole operation was nicknamed Operation Shoestring. That was not the real name for it, but it's what it was because the only Marine units they really had available to go in, to start an offensive and stop the Japanese advance in the Solomon Islands, which was going to endanger Australia, because if they had been able to set up their air base on Guadalcanal, they could have threatened American supply routes from uh, United States and Hawaii into the South Pacific down to Australia. They could have interdicted a lot of those ships with their long-range bombers and long-range fighters. And so the decision was made by the United States Navy to we're gonna put Marines here. We're gonna take that airfield, and then we're gonna hold it on. We're gonna hold on to it for dear life. And it also almost came to that. Guadalcanal was in the Solomons, and those islands were horrible. They are still horrible. They are mosquito infested, malaria infested, dengue fever infested, all sorts of tropical diseases. They were not tropical paradises. Almost all the Marines had malaria. The conditions were horrible. So we'll get into this later in the war. In this chronicle, you'll see the United States Navy abandoned them without enough supplies when the Japanese attacked after the invasion and destroyed a lot of their cruisers. And the Navy turned tail and ran, basically. They had to use Japanese, and you had to eat Japanese food and use Japanese equipment to finish the airfield. So they went through an awful lot, but they were brave. They held on. They took everything the Japanese could throw at them, and they won. And on this date, December 9th, 1942, the United States Army took over. Major General Alexander Patch had the Army do the rest of the campaign, which was mostly just mopping up. And the U.S. Marine Division began to withdraw, and they were stationed in Australia so they could rest and recuperate from that horrible theater and that horrible island, and get ready for the push to get the Japanese out of the Pacific. And then finally, on December 9th, 1944, in the 1944 Soviet counteroffensive, well, not even counteroffensive, even major offensive, they reached the Danube River in Hungary. They reached the river north of Danube. They ended up besieging Budapest for about 100 days or so. They didn't go in and destroy it, which I guess is good for us who love history, because obviously, as the second capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, lots of really historical buildings there and architecture that we're very grateful and fortunate that that did not happen. The destruction did not happen, but it just, in 1944, the Soviet army was a juggernaut. Uh, you know, a lot of that had to do with Lend-Lease and the Americans and the British supplying the Soviets with equipment. The Don't get me wrong. I mean, the Soviet-made equipment was, the T-34 tanks, their Yak planes, their Eel attack bombers. They were all homemade and very well done. But they would not have been as mobile in 1944 if it hadn't been for those 100,000 trucks that we shipped all the way from America to them via, the Arctic ocean convoys or through Iran, which is Persia at the time. But at this time, the Germans had lost all their mobility. They did, Blitzkrieg or Lightning War was just a, you know, fond memory. They were pretty much relying on horsepower by this time, and of course, with 10-to-1 numbers, there's no way that it was just again, it was ever since 41 when they didn't take Moscow, it was always going to come to this. And so in the summer of 44, the Soviets started this sweeping attack on all parts of the front, but especially on this one, they did a sweep south. And they went up through Romania, Bulgaria, and into Hungary, and that's was the culmination of this part of it in the sense that they reached the Danube River, which was a very important benchmark, and eventually, taking Berlin and knocking the Germans out of the war with our help, of course. And so that's it for today, December 9th. I appreciate you watching this video, and I look forward to you looking at or watching my video tomorrow.